The sitting room of the Nosu compound had always made Adana feel like a person standing in a painting she had not been invited into. Not because of the furniture, though the furniture was the specific, heavy, expensive kind that announces itself. Not because of the photographs on the wall, though the photographs told the story of a family across 4 generations with the specific, curated quality of people who understand that rooms are arguments about who you are. It was something else. Something in the quality of the light, or the arrangement of the chairs, or the way Chief Mrs. Nosu occupied a room. The specific, long-practiced ease of a woman who has spent 60 years being the most important person in every space she entered and has long since stopped having to try. Adana had sat in this room many times in 3 years of marriage. She had sat in it at Christmas when the food was served and the conversation moved around her like water around a stone. Not hostile, simply directed elsewhere, toward the people who belonged. She had sat in it on Sunday afternoons when Chief Mrs. Nosu received visitors and introduced her daughter-in-law with the specific, fractional pause before daughter-in-law that said everything the woman never said directly. She had sat in it during the conversations that were not conversations, the observations that landed like statements, the questions that were not questions, the specific, practiced language of a woman who could diminish someone completely without ever raising her voice. She knew this room. She knew it the way you know a place that has never been yours. Today there were lawyers. 2 of them. Men in good suits with the composed, professional quality of people who have been present at the endings of many things and have learned to carry that without showing it. They were seated to one side with documents in front of them. Chief Mrs. Nosu was in her chair, the chair she always occupied, the one that was not technically at the head of the arrangement but functioned as the head regardless. Chief Nosu was beside her, present and quiet in the way he was always present and quiet. The specific, long-practiced silence of a man who has spent 40 years allowing his wife to speak for both of them and calls it harmony. And Emeka was seated across the low table from Adana, and he was not looking at her. This was the thing she had known when she walked into the room, had known before she came through the gate, had known when Obi called her the evening before with the specific, careful voice of someone delivering information they wish they did not have to deliver. She had known that Emeka would not look at her. Not because he did not feel anything, because he felt too much and had decided to do it anyway, and looking at her would make the decision harder, and he had already decided. Chief Mrs. Nosu began to speak. She spoke the way she always spoke, measured, certain, the specific quality of someone who has rehearsed not the words but the conviction. She said that the family had been patient. She said that the marriage had not produced what a marriage of this kind should produce. She said that Adana was a good woman. She said this the way you say something true that you intend to use as a foundation for something unkind, but that good was not the same as suitable, and suitable was what the Nosu family required. She said that the decision had not been made lightly. Adana listened. She had spent 3 years learning to listen in this room, to hear what was being said beneath what was being said, to receive the specific, layered language of a woman who never said the plain thing if the decorated version would do more damage. She looked at Emeka once more. He was looking at the table. The lawyers slid the documents across. She picked up the pen. She did not read the documents. She had read them 3 days ago when her own lawyer had gone through them with her, had sat with the specific, clinical precision of a man explaining the terms of an ending. She knew what they said. She signed where she was required to sign. She set the pen down. She stood up. She looked at Chief Mrs. Nosu. She said nothing to her. She looked at Emeka. She said, "You will spend the rest of your life knowing what you did in this room today." She said it without anger, or rather with the specific, compressed quality of someone for whom anger has been converted into something more durable and more accurate. She said it the way you say a true thing you have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down in the place it belongs. Then she walked out. Through the sitting room and through the corridor and through the compound gate and into the specific quality of the city afternoon that was proceeding entirely indifferently to what had just happened inside that building. The sun was where it always was. The street was what it always was. A man selling newspapers at the corner had no interest in her whatsoever, which was the most honest thing available. She stood on the pavement. She thought, all right. She thought, all right, now. She got a taxi. She went home. Home was her parents' house in the mainland. She had not planned to end up here, had planned, when she moved her things out of the Nosu house 3 weeks ago, to go directly to the flat she had found in a quiet part of the city, the small decent space that would be hers entirely, that nobody could ask her to leave. But when the taxi reached the junction, she had said the mainland instead of a quiet part of the city without deciding to, and now she was here on the street she grew up on, standing outside the house where her father was probably at his sewing machine and her mother was probably not yet back from the market. Her father was at his sewing machine. He looked up when she came in. He was a quiet man, had always been a quiet man, the specific, considered quality of someone for whom words were tools that should be used only when necessary and should be the right tools when they were used. He looked at his daughter's face. He set down what he was working on. He said, "Sit down." She sat down. He did not say "I told you so," because he was not that kind of man. He did not say anything for a while. He simply continued with what he was doing, the specific, unhurried rhythm of a man who has been sewing for 40 years and understands that the work and the silence can coexist. Adana sat and watched his hands and let the rhythm of it work on her the way it had always worked on her since she was small, sitting in this same chair watching these same hands. After a while he said, "Your mother will be back at 6. She said, "I know." He said, "There is food on the stove." She said, "Thank you, Papa." He went back to work. She went to the kitchen. She heated the food. She sat at the kitchen table and she ate, and outside the window the specific, ordinary sounds of the mainland on a weekday afternoon continued. Children, a generator somewhere, a woman calling across a fence to her neighbor. The sounds of a place that had always been real, that had not required her to be anything other than what she was. She thought about the sitting room with the lawyers. She thought about Emika's face, looking at the table. She thought, that is finished now. Whatever that was, it is finished. The question is what comes next. She washed her plate. She went back to her father's workroom. She sat down in the chair beside his machine. She said, "Papa, can I use the other machine tomorrow?" He looked at her. He said, "It needs a new needle. I will put one in tonight." She said, "Thank you." He said nothing else. He went back to work. She sat beside him, and the afternoon moved around them, and the specific, quiet understanding of a father and daughter who have always spoken most clearly through the things they do not say settled over the room like something familiar coming back. She had always known fabric. This was not a small thing. There are people who work with fabric for 20 years and never know it, who understand the technical requirements, the weights and the counts and the care instructions, but who do not know it the way Adana knew it, which was in the specific physical way of someone who grew up with it, who learned to read it before she learned to read words. Her father had taught her. Not formally, simply by being someone who worked with fabric every day and who talked about it the way other people talked about the weather, as the ongoing, present, available subject of daily life. She knew which fabrics held their color and which ones lied about it. She knew which ones draped and which ones stood. She knew what a woman's body required from the things that covered it, not what fashion said it required, what the body itself required, the specific conversation between cloth and person that happens when a garment is exactly right and produces the particular, unannounced quality of a woman who is entirely comfortable in what she is wearing. Her shop was on a street in the mainland that had 4 other fabric shops and a tailor on one end and a dry cleaner on the other. It was small, 2 rooms, fabric bolted to the walls, a cutting table, 2 sewing machines. She had opened it 2 years before she met Emika and had run it through the 3 years of marriage from a slight distance, checking in on Tuesdays and Saturdays, relying on Tanya to manage the day-to-day with the specific, capable loyalty of someone who has decided that a person's business is worth caring about because the person is worth caring about. Tanya Briggs had been her friend since secondary school. She was the kind of friend that most people only have one of if they are lucky, the person who was present before there was anything to be present for and who has never made Adana feel that the friendship required a performance or a reciprocal accounting. She had not liked Emika from the beginning, had said so once, directly, and then had never said it again because Adana had made her choice and Tanya respected choices even when she disagreed with them. When the divorce happened, Tanya did not say "I told you so" either, which meant that the 2 most important people in Adana's life were alike in this way, and she recognized this as a form of luck she had done nothing to earn and was grateful for it. The morning after she arrived at her parents' house, she went to the shop. Tanya was already there, had been there since 7, had opened up and sorted the new stock and was at the cutting table working through an order when Adana came in. She looked at Adana. Adana looked at her. Tanya said, "Sit down. I will make tea." Adana said, I am fine. Tanya said, I know you are fine. Sit down anyway. I will make tea. She sat. Tanya made tea. They drank it. The shop was quiet around them in the specific, useful way of a space that has been yours long enough that it requires nothing from you except your presence. Tanya said, what do you want to do? Adana said, I want to build something they cannot ignore. Tanya looked at her for a moment. She said, all right, tell me what you need. The flat in a quiet part of the city came 2 weeks later. Small, decent, entirely hers. A kitchen with a window that looked onto a courtyard where someone had planted something green that grew regardless. A bedroom. A sitting room that she arranged with the specific, considered quality of someone who has decided that the space they occupy is a statement about who they are and intends to get the statement right. She put her father's old sewing mannequin in the corner. She put fabric samples on the wall, not decoratively, functionally, the working wall of a designer who needs to see what she is thinking spread out at full scale. She made a list. The list had 3 things on it. The first was expand the shop. The second was design a collection. The third was find one person who matters in this industry and make sure they know the work. She put the list on the wall beside the fabric samples. She looked at it. She said, all right. She went to sleep. The expansion happened in the 2nd year. Not dramatically. Adana did not believe in dramatic gestures because dramatic gestures were for people who needed an audience, and she had stopped needing an audience somewhere in the middle of 3 years of being looked at in that sitting room. The expansion was practical. A larger space 3 doors down from the original shop became available, and she took it. She knocked through the wall between the 2 spaces and created something that was still modest by the standards of the industry but was entirely different in what it communicated. A working studio rather than a fabric shop. A place where things were made rather than simply sold. She hired 2 people. A seamstress named Patience, 40, experienced, with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who has been doing excellent work for long enough that she no longer needs to explain herself to anyone. And a young woman named Grace who was 22 and had studied pattern making at a polytechnic in the East and had come to the city with the specific, forward-tilting quality of someone who has decided that where they are going is more interesting than where they have been. Tanya handled the money, had always handled the money, had a particular gift for the financial side that Adana respected completely and did not attempt to replicate. What Tanya was doing with the accounts was not simple bookkeeping. It was the specific, careful work of someone who understands that a small business is one bad decision away from collapse and who has decided that the business she is managing will not be making that decision. The first collection happened in the 3rd year. Not a formal collection in the industry sense, not runway, not press, not the full machinery of a fashion presentation. A showing. 12 pieces, a rented space, invited guests. Buyers Adana had met through the market connections her mother had built over 30 years. 2 women who ran boutiques in the expensive part of the city. A journalist from a style publication who owed Tanya a favor and had come out of obligation and stayed out of genuine interest. The pieces were specific. This was the thing that distinguished them. Not the most elaborate pieces in the room, not the most expensive fabrics, but the most specific. Each one was built around a precise understanding of what a particular kind of woman needed from her clothes. The kind of woman who had somewhere to be and needed to arrive there already feeling like herself. The kind who had spent years wearing things that were almost right and had stopped believing that exactly right was available to her. The pieces said, I see you. I made this for you. You do not have to perform anything while you are wearing this. The boutique buyers placed orders. The journalist wrote 400 words in her column the following week. Not a review exactly, more the specific kind of attention a writer gives something that surprised them by being better than expected. She mentioned the name Adana Okafor twice. Adana read the column at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before the shop opened. She put it down. She went to work. The hotel contract came in the 4th year through a connection that had nothing to do with the showing. A woman named Mrs. Fashola who had been at the market the day Adana's mother introduced them and who had been watching the shop's growth with the specific, patient interest of someone who takes a long time to decide things but decides them permanently. Mrs. Fashola managed procurement for a chain of hotels across 3 cities, and she wanted uniforms that did not look like uniforms, that had the functional requirements of staff clothing but the specific, considered quality of something that communicated the hotel's character rather than simply covering the staff's bodies. Adana spent 2 weeks understanding the brief before she put pencil to paper. She visited each of the hotels. She spent time in the lobbies watching the staff move, the specific way people move in the clothes they are required to wear, the adjustments they make, the places where the fabric works against them rather than with them. She talked to the staff. Not formally, at the ends of shifts, in the car park, the specific conversations of someone who wanted to understand the experience of wearing the thing before she designed the thing. The uniforms she produced were the first pieces that made people in the industry pay attention to her name in the serious way. Not the boutique way, the industry way. The way that means, this person understands something. Mrs. Fashola reordered the following year and referred her to 2 other businesses. Adana Collections was incorporated in year 5. Tanya sat across from her the morning after the paperwork was filed and said, "Your name is on a company." Adana said, "Yes." Tanya said, "Your full name?" Adana said, "Yes." Tanya said, "How does it feel?" Adana considered this. She said, "Like the list is working." Tanya laughed. The specific, warm laugh of someone who has been present since the beginning and understands the full weight of what a small true thing can contain. She said, "It is working." She said, "What is next on the list?" Adana said, "There is no list anymore. Now there is just the company." In the 5th year, Adana thought about Emeka twice. The first time was in January when Obi sent a brief message. A New Year greeting, the same kind she had sent every year since the divorce, never asking anything, never offering anything beyond the simple fact of continued existence and continued care. Adana replied as she always did, briefly, warmly, the specific tone of someone who is glad a connection exists even if it cannot be more than it is. The second time was in October when she walked past a restaurant in the expensive part of the city and saw through the window a man who had Emeka's way of sitting, the specific, slightly formal posture of someone who grew up being told to sit properly and had never quite relaxed out of it. It was not Emeka. She walked on. She thought about him for perhaps 20 minutes that evening. Not with grief, not with anger, simply with the specific, passing quality of someone revisiting a room they used to live in and finding it smaller than they remembered. She did not call Obi about it. She went to the studio the next morning and worked on the new brief. Emeka had married Chisholm in the 2nd year after the divorce. The wedding had been the specific, elaborate production of a family celebrating a correct decision, the kind of wedding that is not about the 2 people in the center of it but about the statement the family is making about itself. Chief Mrs. Nosu had been in the front row in a geli that had been discussed in certain circles for months afterward. Chief Nosu had shaken every hand. Obi had been the bridesmaid who smiled the most correctly and felt the most complicated. Chisholm was everything Chief Mrs. Nosu had wanted in a daughter-in-law. The right family, the right education, the right set of references. She was pleasant and intelligent and had done nothing wrong and would continue to do nothing wrong, and the marriage was the specific, functional quality of a correctly arranged thing. Each component doing what it was designed to do, nothing more or less than that. Emeka managed the family business. The import and export operation his father had built over 30 years was substantial, the kind of business that runs on relationships and institutional knowledge and the specific, ongoing trust of people who have been doing business with you long enough that they have stopped checking your references. Emeka understood the business completely. He was competent and reliable and had the specific, steady quality of someone who will never surprise you. He was not unhappy in any simple sense. What he had was the specific, ongoing quality of a man who made a decision he cannot revisit and who has learned to live alongside the knowledge of it. Not to suppress it, not to be consumed by it, simply to carry it the way you carry something that cannot be set down, that has become part of the weight of who you are. He read about the hotel uniforms in a trade publication in year 4. He read the name Adana Okafor and sat with his coffee for a while. He went back to work. The government contract came in year 7. It was not the kind of thing Adana had been pursuing. She had not built the company with a government contract in mind, had not positioned herself in the specific way that companies position themselves when government money is the target. It came because the people who were assembling the cultural initiative had been looking for a designer who understood West African textile traditions deeply enough to work with them rather than simply appropriate them, and 3 separate people in the industry had given the same name. The contract was for the textile and costume design component of a national cultural exhibition, a large-scale public event that would be seen by many people and covered by every major publication. The budget was significant. The visibility was complete. Adana spent 6 months on it. She went to markets in 4 cities. She sat with weavers and dyers. She documented techniques that had been passed down through families for generations and had never been written down because writing them down had never been necessary when there was always someone to pass them to. She talked to women who were the last people in their communities who knew certain things, and she listened with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who understands that what she is receiving cannot be replaced if she fails to receive it correctly. What she produced was not a collection in the commercial sense. It was a documentation, a making visible of things that had existed in the specific, unannounced way of things that are too ordinary to be celebrated until they are almost gone. The pieces moved through the exhibition and people stood in front of them for longer than people usually stand in front of things. The coverage ran across every major publication in the country. There was a profile photograph. Adana in her studio, surrounded by fabrics and reference materials, standing with the specific, settled quality of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. The profile ran in a Sunday magazine that was read in houses across the city. It ran in houses in the part of the city where old money lived. It ran in a house where Chief Mrs. Nosu took the Sunday magazine with her morning tea and read it in the sitting room with the photographs on the wall. The woman read the profile. She set the magazine down. She looked at the sitting room for a while. She called Emeka. He answered. She read him the headline. There was a silence. She said, "She has done well for herself." Emeka said nothing. She said, "I thought you should know." He said, "I know, Mama." He said, "I have known for a while." She said, "Yes." She put the phone down. Emeka looked at his office wall for a long time. He went back to work. Michael Adeyemi came in year 7. He came through a professional introduction, a mutual contact who described him as someone with money and the specific, rare quality of someone who knows what to do with it. He had made his initial wealth in logistics, had diversified into real estate, and was now looking for what he described to Adana at their first meeting as something with a real center to it. He said, "I have invested in companies that were entirely about the numbers, and I have found that companies entirely about the numbers tend to end up being about nothing. I am interested in something that has a reason to exist beyond the profit." Adana said, "Describe what you mean by a reason to exist." He said, "Something that would be a loss to the world if it stopped. Not just to shareholders. To the world." She looked at him. She said, "Come and see the studio. Then we can talk about whether we have what you are looking for." He came and saw the studio. He came back the following week. He was 40, the specific quality of a man who has spent 20 years building things and carries the experience of it without performing it. He was direct without being aggressive, curious without being intrusive. He asked good questions, the specific kind of question that demonstrates that the person asking has been paying attention and wants to understand rather than to be seen to understand. Adana was cautious. She had been cautious since the sitting room with the lawyers and the documents on the table. She had built a life that was entirely hers, her studio, her company, her flat with the fabric samples on the wall, and she had not needed anyone inside that life in the specific way that requires you to adjust who you are to accommodate them. She did not intend to need it now. But Michael Adeyemi did not ask her to adjust. He understood, or seemed to understand, and the difference between those two things was something she was still determining, that she was someone who had built exactly what she intended to build and did not require either help or permission. He did not offer either. He offered investment, which is a different thing, a professional instrument with defined terms and defined limits. He offered conversation, which is also a different thing. He did not offer himself until she had indicated, through the specific, gradual quality of someone opening a door very slowly to check what is on the other side, that the offer would be received. By the end of year 7, they were having dinner occasionally. Not often enough to call it anything. Enough to know that calling it nothing was becoming inaccurate. Adana told Tanya. Tanya said, "What is he like?" Adana said, "He asks good questions." Tanya said, "That is not what I asked." Adana said, "I know." She said, "He is careful. He pays attention. He does not try to take up more space than he has been given." Tanya said, "That is a very specific list of things to notice about a person." Adana said, "Yes." She went back to work. The 5th year was the year Adana nearly lost everything. Not from failure, from success. The specific, dangerous quality of a business growing faster than the infrastructure holding it together. The hotel contract had produced 3 referrals. The 3 referrals had produced 7 more conversations, of which 5 became real projects. The studio had expanded once and needed to expand again. Patience had trained 2 additional seamstresses and was managing them with the same unhurried authority she brought to everything. But the floor was crowded and the delivery timelines were compressing, and there was a moment in the middle of the 5th year when Adana looked at the order board on the studio wall and understood that she had built something that was about to outgrow the conditions it had been built in. She called Tanya. Tanya came and looked at the order board and looked at the accounts and sat down at the kitchen table in the studio, the small table where they had always made the serious decisions, the table that had been there since the first expansion and had accumulated the specific, quiet authority of a surface that has held many important conversations. And she said, "We need to talk about what we are building." Adana said, "I know." Tanya said, "There are 2 versions of this. The first version is we pull back. We take fewer projects. We protect the quality and the pace and we build slowly for another 3 years." She said, "The second version is we take on a business loan, we build out the full studio space we have been looking at on the floor above, we hire properly, and we accept that the next 18 months are going to be the hardest 18 months we have had." Adana said, "What does the money look like for version 2? Tanya told her. Adana looked at the order board for a moment. She said, "Version 2. Tanya said, "I thought so." The 18 months were exactly as hard as Tanya had said they would be. The loan was structured correctly and Tanya managed it with the specific, vigilant attention of someone who understands that debt is a tool and tools require respect. The floor above was built out, new cutting tables, new machines, a proper sample room, a small meeting space that communicated to the clients who came through it that this was a company that understood what it was. 3 new people joined. Grace was promoted and given her own team. There was a month in the middle of the 18 months when a fabric supplier delivered a wrong order 2 weeks before a major client deadline, and Adana spent 4 days sourcing replacement material from 3 different suppliers and working 17-hour days with Patience and Grace and the team to make the deadline. They made it. The client never knew. There was a week when a payment from a large client was delayed, and the payroll account looked at Adana with the specific, flat honesty of a number that does not have what it needs. She called Tanya at 11 in the evening. Tanya said, "I know. I am already on it." By morning it was handled. A short-term arrangement that Tanya had set up without drama, and that cost them something manageable and bought them the week they needed. There was a morning when Adana arrived at the studio before anyone else and stood in the middle of the expanded floor and looked at what had been built. The full space, the proper equipment, the evidence of something that had grown from 2 machines in a rented room into this. And she stood there for a long time before anyone arrived, in the specific, private quality of someone receiving their own work before they have to share it with the day. She said nothing. She put on her apron. She went to work. The 5th year was also the year Adana's mother became ill. Not seriously. A chest infection that required 2 weeks of rest and a course of medication, and the specific, enforced stillness of a woman who had been at the market every day for 30 years and did not know how to be at home in the middle of a weekday. Adana went to her parents' house every evening for those 2 weeks. She brought food and sat with her mother, and they talked in the specific, unhurried way they talked when there was time and nowhere else to be. Her mother said one evening, "Do you remember when you used to sit at the stall and sort the fabric ends for me?" Adana said, "I was 4 years old." Her mother said, "You were 3. You could already tell the difference between Ankara and Kent by feel. I used to test you with your eyes closed." Adana said, "I remember." Her mother said, "Your father always said you had the hands." Adana said, "He put a new needle in the machine for me. The night of the divorce. He did not ask. He just put it in." Her mother was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is your father. He does not say the thing. He does the thing." Adana said, "I know." Her mother looked at her. She said, "You are doing the thing too." Adana said, "Yes." Her mother said, "Then I have no worries." She turned back to the television. Adana sat beside her. The evening moved around them, the specific, ordinary warmth of a house that has been a house for a long time and has absorbed all the things that have happened inside it and holds them quietly. The 7th year was the year Adana understood what the company was for. Not in the commercial sense, she had always understood the commercial sense. In the deeper sense, The sense that had been building since the day she sat in the markets in 4 cities listening to weavers talk about techniques their grandmothers had taught them and their granddaughters would not learn because the granddaughters had gone to the city and the city had different requirements. She started a documentation program. It was not part of any project brief. It was not commissioned by a client. It was simply something she decided to do because she was in a position to do it and because if she did not do it nobody would. She sent Grace and a photographer to 5 communities over the course of the year. They documented. They filmed. They recorded the names of the weavers and the names of the techniques and the specific histories of each one, where they came from, how long they had been practiced, what they required. She built a small archive. Not a public one, not yet. A working archive, a record, the specific kind of thing that has no immediate commercial value but is the foundation of everything that comes later because it is the thing that knows what it knows before it is needed. Tanya looked at the archive file on the studio computer one afternoon and said, "This is not in the budget." Adana said, "No." Tanya said, "I am going to find a line for it." Adana said, "Thank you." Tanya said, "It is the right thing to do." She went back to the accounts. In the 7th year Obi came to the studio for the first time. She came without announcement, had called the morning of and said, "I am going to be in that part of the city today. Is it all right if I stop by?" Adana had said yes. She had said it in the specific, careful tone of someone who means yes and also means that yes has a shape and is not unlimited. Obi came at 3 in the afternoon when the studio was full and working, the specific, purposeful energy of a creative floor doing serious things. She came in and stood at the entrance for a moment before Adana saw her. She was looking at the room with the specific quality of someone receiving something that is larger than they had prepared themselves for. Adana crossed the floor and said, "Obi." Obi said, "Adana." She said, She stopped. She said, "I did not know. I knew. I followed everything. But seeing it is different." Adana said, "Come and sit down." They sat in the small meeting space. Grace brought tea. Obi looked at the exhibition prints on the wall, photographs from the documentation project, the weavers, the techniques, the specific visual record of something that had been almost invisible. She said, "Are these from the archive project?" Adana said, "Yes." "How do you know about that?" Obi said, "I follow everything." She said, quietly, from a distance. She looked at the table. She said, "I should have been louder. In the compound. When it was happening. I knew it was wrong. I said it to Emeka privately and I never said it to my mother and I never said it publicly and you paid the price for what I did not do." She said, "I am sorry." She said it directly, without performance, the specific quality of someone who has been carrying an apology for 6 years and has finally found the right moment. Adana looked at her. She said, "I know." Obi said, "Does that mean it is received?" Adana said, "It means I know." She said, "Some things take time to receive fully. But I know that you mean it and I know you are here." Obi said, "I am here." They drank their tea. Obi stayed for an hour. She asked questions about the archive project and about the government exhibition brief and about the business structure. Good questions, the specific kind that demonstrate attention rather than performance. When she left, she paused at the door and looked at the floor one more time. She said, "He misses you." She said it quietly, not as an opener for a larger conversation, simply as a fact she had decided Adana should have. Adana said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I know." She said, "It does not change anything. But I know." Obi left. Adana stood at the studio entrance for a moment. Then she went back to the work table. She picked up the brief she had been reading before Obi arrived. She read from where she had stopped. In year 7, Emeka sat in his office on a Thursday evening when everyone else had gone and looked at the accounts. He had been looking at various versions of this accounting for 4 months. The deterioration was documented in numbers that did not lie and did not soften and did not have the specific, manageable quality he had hoped they would have when he started looking at them. The import margins were thin. The supplier relationship had not been repaired. He had tried twice and the relationship had a quality now that was not fully reparable, the specific residual damage of trust that has been strained once too often. The bank had asked its questions and he had answered them and the answers had been honest and the bank had listened with the careful, reserved quality of an institution that has heard honest answers before and knows that honesty does not always solve the problem. He picked up his phone. He looked at the name Adana Okafor in his contacts. He had never deleted it, which was the kind of thing that said something about a person. He looked at it for a long time. He put the phone back down. He thought about the sitting room 10 years ago. He thought about the table he had been looking at when she signed. He thought about what she had said when she stood up, and he had not looked at her even then, had kept his eyes down until the door closed. You will spend the rest of your life knowing what you did in this room today. He had spent it knowing. The specific, ongoing quality of that knowledge, not guilt exactly, because guilt requires a belief that the decision could have been different and he was no longer certain it could have been, given who he was then and what he had been able to withstand then. Something more like accuracy. The accurate knowledge of someone who has made a decision and has seen, over the years that followed, the full shape of what that decision cost and what it produced and what it failed to produce. He thought about the Sunday magazine profile. He thought about the photograph, her standing in the studio surrounded by fabric and reference materials with the specific, settled quality of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. He had kept the magazine. He had not told anyone he had kept it. It was in the second drawer of his desk, underneath other papers. He did not open the drawer. He turned off the office light. He drove home. What Chisholm knew she did not say. She was an intelligent woman, and she had always been an intelligent woman, and she had known since before the wedding. Had understood from the specific, careful way Emeka's family had avoided saying the name that there was a name that was not being said. That the marriage she was entering had a history she was not part of, and that the history mattered. She had made her own decision. The family was right for her family. Emeka was decent and reliable and would not diminish her. She was not in love in the specific, ungovernable way that produces the kind of stories that people tell for generations, but she had decided early that the ungovernable kind was not what she wanted, that what she wanted was partnership and stability and a life she could see the shape of. She had that. In the 8th year, when the business difficulties were visible in the house in the specific way that financial pressure is always eventually visible, the conversations that stop when she enters, the evenings where Emeka sat with something he was not ready to share. She asked him once directly, "What is happening with the business?" He told her. She listened. She asked good questions. She said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "I need to know it does not affect how you see us." She said, "It does not affect how I see us." He said, "Thank you." She said, "But Emeka, this is not a problem you are going to solve alone. You are going to need to ask for help." He said, "I know." She said, "From wherever it needs to come from." She said it in the specific, considered way of someone who means more than the words say and trusts the other person to receive the full meaning. He looked at her. She went back to what she was doing. He sat with the full meaning for a long time. Obi received her mother's call on a Tuesday morning in year 8. She had been expecting it, had known since the previous year when she saw the shape of the business difficulty and understood that there was only one direction the need would eventually point. She had spent the intervening months thinking about how to ask. About what she owed Adana. About what the family owed Adana. About whether a business case and an apology were the same thing or whether they needed to be different things offered separately. After she put the phone down, she sat at her kitchen table for an hour. She thought about Adana at 26 in the compound sitting room. The specific, composed quality of a young woman receiving something unjust without collapsing under it. Signing the papers, standing up, and saying the one true thing before she left. She thought about Adana at 36 in the studio surrounded by 10 years of work. She thought about the distance between those two images and what it contained, the father's sewing machine, the flat in the quiet part of the city, the first collection, the hotel uniforms, the archive project, the government exhibition, the name on the glass at the front of the building. She thought, "This is what we dismissed." She picked up her phone. She called Adana. The Nosu family business began to struggle in year 8. Not suddenly, the specific quality of a business beginning to fail is rarely sudden. It is gradual and then accelerating and then suddenly visible, the way that certain kinds of damage work. Invisible until the moment they are undeniable. The import margins had been contracting for 2 years. A combination of policy changes and a key supplier relationship that had deteriorated and had not been repaired with the urgency it required. Emeka had managed these problems the way he managed everything. Competently, steadily, without the specific, lateral thinking that the moment required. Chief Nosu was aging. He was still present, still came to the office 3 days a week, still received certain visitors, still carried the weight of the relationships he had built over 40 years. But the relationships were his, not the company's, not transferable, the specific, personal kind of connection that belongs to one person and does not survive that person's diminishment. As he became less present, the connections became less available, and the business that had been built on those connections found itself on ground that was less solid than it had always appeared. By the end of year 8, the bank was asking questions. Not threatening ones. The specific, careful questions of an institution that has begun to notice a pattern and wants to understand it before the pattern becomes a problem. Emeka answered them. He answered them honestly because he was an honest man and because he did not know how else to be. The bank listened. The bank made notes. Emeka went home that evening and sat in the sitting room with a drink. He did not finish and thought about the business his father had built and the specific, accumulating weight of being the person responsible for whether it continued. Chisholm came in and said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I have some things to work through." She said, "Do you want to talk about it?" He said, "Not yet. I will know more in a few days." She went back to what she was doing. She was not unkind. She was a decent person and had always been a decent person, and she could read the quality of the silence correctly enough to know when it needed to be left alone. But there was a limit to what she could receive from him in these moments, and they both knew it, and neither of them had ever said so, which was the specific quality of their marriage, the things they had agreed without agreeing not to discuss. Chief Mrs. Nosu did not panic. This was one of the things about her that Emeka had always respected, even in the years when he had resented most else about her, that she did not panic. She received difficult information with the same contained quality she brought to everything, processed it privately, and produced a response that was practical rather than reactive. Her response to the business difficulty was to call in the favors. She had many of them, 40 years of being the wife of a significant man in a city where significance as currency had produced a considerable reserve. She called them methodically. Some were honored. Some were honored partially. Some were declined with the specific, careful language of people who were facing their own difficulties and could not accommodate someone else's. A few were declined with less care, the specific, revealing bluntness of people who had been waiting for the opportunity to decline and were relieved to have it. She sat with the results. She was not a person who was easily surprised. But the specific quality of discovering how many of the connections she had assumed were durable were in fact conditional. This surprised her. Not the individual declines, the pattern of them, the shape of what was and was not available when the request was real rather than theoretical. She thought about this for several days. Then she called Obi. Obi had been waiting for this call for 2 years. Not with hope exactly, with the specific, watchful quality of someone who has been monitoring a situation from a careful distance and has known for a long time what the situation would eventually require. She had kept her connection to Adana quiet. Not hidden. She had told Emeka years ago that she stayed in touch, had told him plainly, and had been met with the specific, complicated silence of a man who did not know what to do with the information and had chosen to do nothing with it. She had not told her mother. Not because she was afraid of her mother's response. She was past being afraid of her mother's responses, but because it was not her mother's business. When Chief Mrs. Nosu called and described the situation and said, "There is a government textile contract being tendered," Obi listened carefully. Her mother said, "The Adana Collections Company is the best positioned of any local firm to partner on it. The government contact has said as much." She said it in the specific, neutral tone of someone stating a fact they have decided to treat as purely factual. Obi said, "And you want me to approach her?" Her mother said, "You have kept in contact with her." Obi said, "Yes." Her mother said, "Then you are the appropriate person to make the initial contact." There was a silence. Obi said, "Mama, I need to ask you something." Her mother said, "Yes." Obi said, "When you ask me to do this, when you are asking Adana for this, do you understand what you are asking? Do you understand the full shape of what you are asking her to do for this family?" She said, "I was not a child when it happened. I was 20. I knew it was wrong then, and I said nothing publicly, and you said nothing publicly, and Adana paid the price for what neither of us was willing to say out loud." Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I understand." Obi said, "And?" Her mother said, And I am asking anyway. Because the family needs it. Obi sat with this. She said, all right, I will contact her. She put the phone down. She sat for a long time. Then she called Adana. Adana was in the studio when the call came. She was in the middle of reviewing fabric samples for a new brief. Running her hands along the lengths of cloth the way she had done since she was small, the specific physical language of someone reading something that does not have words. She looked at the name on her phone. She answered. Obi said, Adana, I need to ask you something and I want to do it in person if that is possible. She said, I also want to say before we meet that I know what I am asking and I know I do not have the right to ask it. Adana said, come to the studio. Tomorrow morning. Obi came. She came in the specific, careful way of someone who has prepared for a difficult conversation and knows that the preparation only goes so far. She sat down across from Adana in the studio, surrounded by fabric and reference materials and the working evidence of 10 years of building something real, and she made the case honestly. The contract, the terms, the mutual benefit if the partnership was structured correctly. And then she stopped making the case and simply said, I am sorry. I am sorry for what happened in that sitting room. I am sorry I was not louder about it when it was happening. She said, that is not the reason I am here. But I needed to say it before I asked you anything. Adana listened to all of it. She said, I need 3 days. Obi said, of course. She stood up. She looked around the studio for a moment, at the fabrics on the walls, the work tables, the evidence of the company. She said, you built something extraordinary. Adana said, I know. She said it without arrogance and without performance, with the specific, accurate quality of someone stating a true thing. Obi left. Adana sat for a long time. Then she called Tanya. Tanya listened to the full account without interrupting. When Adana finished, Tanya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the contract is real. I have seen the tender. She said, if the terms are structured correctly, it would be the largest single contract the company has taken. She said, that is the business case. Adana said, yes. Tanya said, and the other case? Adana said, I am not doing it for them. I want to be clear about that. I am doing it because it is the right business decision and because I am not going to let what they did to me make me smaller than I am. Tanya said, that is the Adana Okafor I have known since we were 17 years old. She said, I will start working on the terms tomorrow. She also told Michael. They were having dinner when she told him. The occasional dinners that had become less occasional over the preceding months, that had acquired the specific, warm quality of something that is establishing itself without either party needing to announce it. She told him the full story, the divorce, the sitting room, the 10 years, and now this. He listened with the full, specific attention she had learned to trust in him. When she finished, he said, what do you want from me? She said, your honest assessment. Is the contract as good as the numbers suggest? He said, yes. He said, I have looked at the tender independently. The numbers are correct. She said, and? He said, and I think you already know what you are going to do. I think you decided in the studio when Obi left. I think you called me to say it out loud to someone who is entirely on your side. She looked at him. She said, yes, that is what I did. He said, then do it. She said, I intend to. The meeting happened 10 days later. Adana's office. Her building, the full studio and offices the company had grown into, 5 floors, the name on the glass at the front. Not the Nosu compound. Not any neutral ground. Her ground, because the terms of this meeting were hers to set and she had set them without drama, simply by naming the location. Obi came. And then, because Obi had said she would come and Adana had said nothing to prevent it, Chief Mrs. Nosu came. She came in the specific, composed way she brought to all things, dressed with the careful authority of someone who understands that how you enter a room is a statement. She was 62 and she wore it with the particular quality of someone who has never doubted their own significance. But the compound was not here. The lawyers were not here. The photographs on the wall were not here. The photographs on Adana's wall were the government exhibition pieces, the textiles she had documented and made visible, the things that had been almost gone and were now on the wall of a company that bore her name. Chief Mrs. Nosu looked at them when she came in. She did not say anything about them. But she looked. Adana was behind her desk. She stood when they entered, the correct professional gesture, nothing more, and she gestured to the chairs and said, "Please sit down." Her voice was even. Her face was composed. If there was anything else in the room, it was the specific, invisible quality of 10 years of work conducted in the presence of a decision that had been made in someone else's sitting room, and that is not the kind of thing that is visible, but it is not the kind of thing that is absent either. Chief Mrs. Nosu sat. She looked at Adana. She began to speak, the prepared version of what she had come to say. She spoke about the contract, the partnership, the mutual benefit. She spoke with the specific, measured quality of someone who has practiced this and is delivering it correctly. She was asking for something, and she was asking for it in the language of business, because the language of business was the only language available to her for a request of this kind, the only one that did not require her to say things she did not know how to say. Adana let her finish. Then she asked 3 questions. Specific, technical, contractual questions about the terms, the timeline, and the performance metrics. Chief Mrs. Nosu answered as precisely as she could. Where she did not know the answer, she said so, which was the first time in Adana's experience of her that the woman had admitted to not knowing something, and it registered as the small, significant thing it was. When the questions were answered, Adana said, "I will have my team prepare the partnership terms. We will send a draft within the week." She stood. She said, "It is good to see you, Ma." She said it without irony, without performance. The correct social phrase, delivered in the correct tone, meaning nothing more or less than what it said. Chief Mrs. Nosu stood. She looked at Adana for a moment. A long moment, the specific quality of someone who has arrived at a recognition they did not anticipate and is sitting with the newness of it. Something crossed her face that was not quite an apology and not quite acknowledgement, but was in the territory of both. The closest this woman would likely come in this lifetime to either. She said, "Thank you." She said it quietly, which was the most it cost her to say anything. Obi, behind her, pressed her lips together. They left. Adana stood at her desk for a moment. Then she sat down. She looked at the exhibition textiles on the wall. She looked at the name on the glass of her building, visible from where she sat, her name in the letters she had chosen, the size she had chosen, placed where she had decided it should be placed. She picked up the phone. She called Tanya. She said, "Prepare the draft." Tanya said, "Already started." Adana smiled. She put the phone down. The partnership contract was signed 6 weeks later. It was the largest contract in the company's history, and it was structured correctly, which meant that both parties received what they needed, and the terms were clear, and the accountability was documented, and there was no room in the arrangement for sentiment to interfere with the business. This was what Adana had built over 10 years. Not a business that ran on relationships and goodwill and the specific inherited trust of people who had known your father, but a business that ran on the quality of its work and the clarity of its terms. A business that could survive scrutiny because everything it was could be examined. The Nosu family business stabilized. Not recovered, stabilized, which is a different and more honest thing. They did not return to the scale they had been before. The business was permanently smaller, and Chief Mrs. Nosu had understood, in the months of the struggle and in the meeting in Adana's office, that the world she had operated in for 40 years had shifted in ways she could not unshift, and that some of what had made the family significant was the specific inherited quality of a generation that was passing rather than the durable quality of something that could be rebuilt. She did not become a different person, but she became, and this was the most the story could claim for her, slightly quieter. The specific, considered quality of someone who has received new information about the world and has decided to sit with it rather than to argue with it. Whether this constituted growth or simply exhaustion, the story did not adjudicate. It noted the quietness and moved on. Emeka and Adana did not reconcile. This was the correct ending, and the story knew it. What had happened in that sitting room 10 years ago was not the kind of thing that reconciliation could address. Not because neither of them was capable of it, but because the thing that would have needed to be rebuilt was not available to be rebuilt. You cannot return to a place that existed in a version of you that no longer exists. What they had was the specific, adult piece of 2 people who had shared something real and damaged it, and had arrived, by different routes and at different costs, at lives that were entirely their own. Emeka sent a message through Obi 2 weeks after the contract was signed. The message said, "I hope the company continues to grow." He said, "I am glad the partnership worked." He said, "I am sorry." He said, "I know that is late and I know what late means." Adana read the message. She sat with it. She wrote back, "Thank you, Emeka." She wrote, "I received it." She put the phone down. She went to the studio. There is something this story wants to say before it closes. Adana Okafor was told she was not enough. Not enough for his family, not enough for their compound, not enough for the specific narrow definition of worth that one woman in one sitting room had decided was the only definition that mattered. She was told this by implication and by structure and by the fractional pause before daughter-in-law and by the lawyers and the documents on the low table. She was told it with the full weight of a family that had been significant in this city for 4 generations and knew how to make its judgments felt. She did not argue. She picked up the pen and signed and walked out into the city afternoon and went home to her parents' house and sat in her father's workroom and said, "Can I use the other machine tomorrow?" And then she built. Not to prove them wrong, that would have required her to remain inside their definition of worth, to accept that their measure was the measure, to spend her energy on their terms rather than her own. She built because building was what she was. Because she had grown up with cloth and understood it and had something to say with it that had not been said yet. Because Tanya was there and the shop was there and the sewing machine was there with the new needle her father had put in, and all of these things were real and available in hers. The justice of this story is not that the Nosu family suffered. They experienced difficulty, which is not the same as suffering, and the difficulty was the result of their own failures of management and relationship and adaptation rather than anything Adana did or intended. The justice is something quieter and more specific. That when they needed help, the person they came to was the woman they had dismissed. That the measure of worth they had used to exclude her had produced, in the 10 years since, exactly nothing of comparable value. That the room they asked her into this time was hers. There is a question this story leaves you with. Think about the room you were asked to leave, the table you were removed from, the judgment that was passed on you by people who had decided before you arrived what you were worth and had no interest in revising it. And ask yourself, what have you built since? Because the most powerful response to being told you do not belong has never been to fight your way back into the room. It has always been to build a better room. And then, when the people who dismissed you need something only you can provide, to let them in. Not from weakness, from the specific, complete authority of someone who owns the door.